We've updated the SPS policy, which says that, of course, if a man with a history of violence towards a woman shouldn't be in a female prison. Now, of course, in the Isla Bryson case, that was a mistake. Well, of course it was a mistake. Of course it was a mistake. And of course it has nothing to do with GRR, because GRR is not in force. No, you can shout. You can shout all you want.
Do you agree with JK Rowling that Nicola Sturgeon was a destroyer of women's rights? Kate Forbes.
I have a lot of respect for both of the women that you have just referenced in that question. And I think JK Rowling is incredibly brave, and I think Nicola Sturgeon has done a lot for women and girls and has been an exceptional mentor when it comes to women and girls. And the way that you've asked that question, I think, goes to the heart of the problems that we're grappling with right now, that we have a binary question, which means you have to take a side. And for me, I think that JK Rowling has been subject to far too much abuse for raising very legitimate concerns. And I think you can also think that Nicola Sturgeon has been pioneering when it comes to women and girls.
OK, Humza Yousaf.
I'll give you a pretty binary answer. No, I don't think Nicola Sturgeon is a destroyer of women's rights at all. Quite the opposite. I think she has spent most of her career, her political career, trying to advance the rights of women. To anybody suggests that she's been a destroyer of women's rights, I'm afraid, is something I just take exception to.
So that's JK Rowling then, that you take exception
Indeed.
to? OK. Ash Regan.
I think JK Rowling has been very brave in the way that she's advocated for this issue at a time, like we were talking about earlier, at a time a few years ago when hardly anyone dared to speak up on this issue because they were fearing for their livelihoods. It was such a toxic debate that you couldn't say anything. I think it's changed a little bit in the last couple of years. So I think she was very brave to do that. And I think people speaking out gave other people confidence to speak out. So I think that was important. I wouldn't phrase it in the way that she has, but I did have serious concerns about the impact that piece of legislation would have on women's single-sex spaces and exemptions and the ability to uphold them in law and the conflict with the Equality Act. And I felt that women, felt that they were going to be less safe, protected and have less dignity as a result of that. And obviously I ultimately resigned from the government over this issue because I felt I could not vote in good conscience for that piece of legislation.
Can we now talk about...
In the case of the GRR bill, happy to get into the detail of it. For me, what we're looking at and why the Parliament has passed that bill is because we are making life that little bit easier for probably the most stigmatised and marginalised group in the country. That's something I'm happy to support. Okay. But in terms of the GRR bill and the Section 35, let me say, actually, the substance of the bill is not necessarily the relevance here. The relevance is the principle of standing up against that Westminster veto.
Kate Forbes, you were shaking your head there when Humza Yousaf said that the Westminster, they'll block this and then they'll keep blocking and they'll keep blocking. Do you agree that that's what they would do?
Well, I actually do agree that the Westminster government will continue to block legislation. I think they have a mission to erode devolution. But the point when it comes to this legislation is that the legal advice really does matter. So I'm not spoiling for a fight just for the sake of it. I will always stand up for Scotland. It's what I've done as Finance Secretary. It's what I would do as First Minister. But I also think that as a government and a party that wants to be independent, we need to be able to solve our problems ourselves. So we need to be able to find a way through this ourselves.
What would that way be?
Well, I actually support reform of the Gender Recognition Act. I do think that the current gender recognition approach is far too onerous, and it does stigmatise the trans community. And I think that we do need to make it less onerous. But we also need to take women and girls with us. So we need to ensure that we have the confidence of women and girls when it comes to single-sex spaces and don't stigmatise the trans community further. And I think that once I've sought legal advice on the way forward, we can, in Parliament, and I think it should be in Parliament because we're absolutely sent there as elected representatives to solve problems, we can find a way forward that perhaps, going back to the earlier question, has a bit more respect at the heart of the dialogue than we've seen so far.
Okay, very quickly, because we've got to go to an audience.
No, I appreciate that. I suppose there's two questions that I've got. One is the reverse of the question that Asma asked me, which is if the legal advice says that we have a case, then is your principle to absolutely take that to court? So that's the first. And the second one is you want to bring forward an amendment to the bill, but remember this is a bill that's been passed by the majority of Parliament. So the only motivation then surely to do that would be because Westminster are threatening to veto.
No. So we're in a position. So if this bill had passed through Parliament and if it had passed through Parliament and there had been no veto, then it would become law. And the point that I've made is that we're in a position, because of the Section 35, where we need to have an answer to resolving it. And we can either go to court against legal advice and spending money that could be used elsewhere in a cost of living crisis, or we can take that legal advice and make a decision on the back of that. If there is no alternative to court, I'll go to court. But I think there is an alternative to court, and that's the point I'm making. So when it comes to the amendments, my point here is, if we are a party that wants to be independent, a government that wants to be independent, we need to be able to resolve our own challenges ourselves.
If we were independent, we would not have a foreign government, for example, coming in and vetoing our legislation.
Okay, Humza,
the point is, of course, that we have that.
Yeah, you made that point. Let's hear from Ash Regan.
I won't be going to court because I think the legal analysis will tell us that we will lose that court case. And I don't think that shows us standing up to devolution. I think that, or standing up to the UK government, I think that is something that you want to do for things where you have the public behind you. And I think it's very clear that on this issue, the Parliament, so I would say the government and also the Parliament, was out of step with the public's view on this. And, Humza has raised, equalities and that we should always be protecting everyone's rights, and we should be. That's absolutely right. However, we do everyone a disservice when we don't mention the fact that rights often come into conflict. And that's the part of this that we didn't quite get right. So, and people like Humza and my other colleagues, they need to explain why they voted against some safeguarding amendments that were put forward by myself and others. So I was part of a group of people who submitted amendments we felt that would increase safeguarding. I voted for everything that I thought would increase safeguarding. Not many of them were successful. I think I was the only person that got an amendment through that was not supported by the government. And I also think there's an argument here, potentially, and if I'm going by what the members of the public have told me about their dismay, really, with watching this piece of legislation pass through the Parliament at all the different stages, and they felt that at every turn, they were being shut out and their voices weren't being heard. They weren't able to get in front of the decision makers. No one was listening to what they were saying. And I wonder if there's a case now, having watched that process, for strengthening the committee system or changing some of the ways we do things so that we don't get into this position again where we've ended up passing a law that the public do not support.
Okay, Humza Yousaf, on the subject of amendments, is it fair to say that no law is perfect? Do you regret not voting for amendments that would put rapists in women's prisons?
No, I don't, because there was a substantial discussion, of course, on that amendment. What we have done is updated. You haven't had to pass an amendment. We've updated the SPS policy, which says that, of course, if a man with a history of violence towards a woman shouldn't be in a female prison. Now, of course, in the Isla Bryson case, that was a mistake. Well, of course it was a mistake. Of course it was a mistake. And of course it has nothing to do with GRR, because GRR is not in force. No, you can shout. You can shout all you want. But the bill, I'm afraid,
the bill, policy based on self-ID.
The bill is not even in force. So anybody to shout and suggest that it has to do with GRR,
in Scotland
I'm afraid,
are running ahead of the law.
Okay, let Humza finish.
It's simply not correct. So I agree that the policy from SPS should have been the policy that is now the updated one, and that any man with a history of violence should not be in the female estate.